Turn by McKenna! Lovely cushion header. And Giroud! What a head, son! What a head!
Hello and welcome back to the Premier League Trio podcast. My name is Hader and I'm your host as usual today. I'm delighted to be joined by Alan Smith, who is a senior writer for Football London. And he's going to be joining me today to discuss some Chelsea transfers and just the general sort of analysis of some of the great business that Chelsea have done this window. So Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem at all. You've got a name that's definitely synonymous with a lot of footballers, haven't you? You've obviously got the Alan Smith that played for Arsenal and obviously works for Sky now. And then you've got the Alan Smith that used to play for United and Leeds. So, a very footballing name.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how often I get mistaken for mostly the former Arsenal player. I get like quite a bit of tweets from people saying you're crap on FIFA, etc., etc. And then I used to kind of reply and say actually wrong Alan Smith. Yeah, but I just don't bother anymore. I just ignore it.
Oh, that's brilliant.
But
that's so good. Maybe your at name should be Alan Smith, not the FIFA one. Brackets, not the FIFA one.
Yeah. Too late now.
Yeah, exactly. But no, welcome to the podcast. And let's just jump straight into it. And I just want to say that Chelsea, I'm a United fan. So obviously looking over at Chelsea, I'm very jealous of the work that's been done. It's very impressive. But why are Chelsea in such a strong financial position during this pandemic when seemingly most clubs, even the biggest ones in Europe, you look at Real Madrid and Barcelona, who are definitely struggling in terms of their finances at the moment? Why are Chelsea in such a strong financial position to undertake these sort of transfers?
It's a couple of reasons. First big reason, I think, is that obviously the transfer ban meant that the last summer they were obviously unable to spend any money. January they ended up, obviously FIFA had the Court of Arbitration for Sport had changed that FIFA ruling with the ban, so they were allowed to sign players in January, but for a number of different reasons that just didn't happen. They didn't bring anybody in, so you've kind of had that sort of backlog, and effectively this kind of feels like Chelsea are bundling three transfer windows into one this summer. In addition to that, you then have the fees for Eden Hazard, you have the Alvaro Morata fees. That money hadn't been spent. So it's on the face of it, it looks like, oh, Chelsea are spending more than 200 million. The reality is the bulk of that expenditure has come from sort of previous sales. And because of not being able to spend it sort of last summer, we're just seeing sort of an extra effect now. Obviously, the ownership, everyone knows Roman Abramovich, the wealth that's there. That's clearly an influence when you compare it to other clubs as well. But I don't think it's a far more nuanced situation than simply saying, oh, typical Chelsea under Abramovich, they're spending hundreds of millions of pounds because they've got one of the richest owners of football, etc. It is far more complex than that because of those two other reasons outlined. And I think in addition to that as well, I'm sure we'll get on to sort of individual players a bit later on, but if you look at the fees that they've paid, with the exception of the Havertz deal, Ziyech and Werner in particular are sort of could end up being bargains in comparison to other fees that have been spent by other clubs in the past few seasons. Werner, we know Liverpool had been quite interested. Klopp was quite interested. There had been discussions there, and by all means, it sounds like he would have been keen on moving to Liverpool to work under Klopp. But that was obviously several months ago, and since then, I'm not sort of 100% sure what the situation is at Liverpool. But what seemed to happen was that there was a sort of a financial constraint of some sort, which meant that couldn't happen. But then Leipzig's the release clause that they had meant that Chelsea were in a position to sort of jump in. and sign him for a fee that could, like I just said, if he sort of hits the ground running and performs at the same level that he did in the Bundesliga, could end up looking like a bit of a bargain. So yeah, it's not like a case that they're spending silly money on players who may work out or may not. It has been quite sensible, and the fees, with the exception of the Havertz one, aren't as big as you kind of would sort of expect. And I mean, they have brought in five players who will be part of the first team immediately, and Malang Sarr on top of that, who is expected to kind of to go obviously out on loan for the next season coming up.
No, I completely agree with you. If you actually do, you're right. When you look at the individual signings, a lot of them are very reasonably priced. I think Werner's extremely good business, considering he was up there, I believe, behind Lewandowski as the highest, goal and assist maker in the whole of Europe. He put up some phenomenal numbers, and Ziyech as well is another one, which I think will prove to be smart business. But before we move on to the individual players, what's the general mood around Stamford Bridge? Because obviously, it seems like Roman Abramovich is definitely, I guess, more committed again, because there were questions, wasn't there, whether he still had, I guess, the interest in whether making Chelsea, the best side in England again and challenging for Europe. But is there a quiet confidence that something special is happening under Frank Lampard? Because I think from a rival fans' perspective, they're looking at the business and thinking, okay, excellent business. But I think something which perhaps can, and is fairly leveled at Lampard, is that, is he the manager, or does he have, let me rephrase it, not is he the manager, but does he have the ability to coach a side to win a title? I think that's a better way of putting it.
For me anyway, that's the sort of the biggest question this coming season. And I've actually written about this for a piece that'll be published tomorrow morning, on Tuesday morning, basically touching on the fact that there is so much ground for Chelsea to make up. They were obviously ended up at 66 points last season. Liverpool were on 99, and it's quite unprecedented for a team to make up that sort of ground. Only twice in Premier League history have a team gone from finishing outside the top three and gone on to win the title the following season. That was Leicester, obviously, and then the following season, Conte's Chelsea, and that was basically because Chelsea had finished 10th the previous campaign, and there was the sad end to Mourinho's second spell. So there's quite a lot of context to add in there. But generally, the champions are either, like since 92, 93, the champions have either, the reigning champions, or they finished second or third the previous season. So you need to factor that in. I look at the squad and I think it's going, from a neutral's point of view and from someone who obviously gets to cover Chelsea quite a bit, it's going to be really exciting, because I'm still not convinced by the defence. I know Thiago Silva has come in, and his experience, etc., will obviously play a role, but Kepa and Caballero are still the only goalkeeping options, and that is a massive concern. So I wouldn't be surprised to see quite a few sort of 5-3, 4-4 draws throughout the season. But yeah, to go back to your point in terms of Lampard, I felt even during last season that he needed someone in the backroom team who's capable of sort of coaching defensively. If you look at the backroom staff, they're all really good coaches in their own certain ways, but there isn't that defensive expert in there to sort of drill the back four or a back five. And if you look at the talent of the individual players for large spells of last season, those quite a few of those players played below their own capabilities. You look at Tony Rudiger, who obviously was coming off a serious injury. His first two seasons at Chelsea, he was really, really good. This season just passed, he admitted himself before the FA Cup final that he hadn't hit that form. He didn't really go into the reasons why. If there was any particular reason, whether it was sort of a lingering effect from the injury or anything like that, there wasn't any elaboration. But he did admit that my form hasn't been sort of where it should be. Beyond that, Andreas Christensen has been hit and miss at centre back. Fikayo Tomori was quite interesting. He obviously, at the beginning of last season, it looked like he would be probably sort of a bit part player, but then sort of rose really quickly into becoming. I think Lampard had said it was before the Ajax game, the Ajax away game in the Champions League, and Lampard had spoken a little bit about how Tomori had become effectively his first choice centre back, and he had been really good up till Christmas. Then, for whatever reason, he played just one league game in 2020, which was away to Bournemouth in, I think it was mid-January. Wasn't particularly impressive, and after that only featured in sort of a couple of FA Cup games, and then after lockdown, during the restart, he was suffering from an injury as well, and then you have the other centre back, obviously, was Kurt Zuma, who started the season probably a little bit slowly, but towards the end of the campaign, he looked like the best of those four centre back options. Is it a defence that's good enough to win a Premier League? I'm really not sure, and I'm not massively sold on Silva just because, based on age, the fact he hasn't played in the Premier League before, and with Silva, I keep thinking, who was the last player, the last successful player from another European league to arrive in England um, in his mid to late 30s and have some success?
Zlatan Ibrahimovic, I would say, probably at United. He's probably the only one I can think of that's
But in
joined
terms
at
of
that
yeah,
age.
but in terms of like, would you have considered, like, how successful was he really? Um,
First season, I think he was
yeah,
excellent. He missed a lot of chances though, and that was a big thing for United. He missed. He got 17 goals, I believe, in the league in his first season, but he easily should have doubled that. The amount of chances he missed. I think he was the biggest thing about him was the mentality. He came in and brought a winning mentality. He essentially controlled that dressing room for Jose Mourinho, and when obviously he left, it fell apart. Pogba obviously was, I guess, let loose. I don't want to say it's all Pogba's fault because it's not. There's a lot of things that went on behind the scenes there. Obviously, we all know Jose very well. But what I would say is that maybe the aspect which I'm most impressed about is that Thiago Silva will bring that leadership, that experience. He can organize the defense. If you're putting someone like Kurt Zuma who has legs around him and obviously Reece James on the right, then possibly it could do. But where I have doubts, and I think you've touched on it, I'll let you carry on, but where I have doubts is whether he can deal with the physicality and the pace of the league. I wouldn't say Silva as well as a defender who can win headers in the box. I've never really thought he was one of those sort of those defenders. I think you look at Chelsea's defensive record, especially at set pieces and corners, it's awful. So is Silva actually an improvement?
yeah, and just to sort of add another layer of concern, Chelsea played with quite a high defensive line, and you would sort of worry, like, say, if Silva comes up against Jamie Vardy, as one example, this season, and the sort of the back four have pushed up high, you would fear for him in those situations. Considering how tightly packed the season is going to be, I think rotation is going to be more sort of important than ever. So it's not, you're not likely to have a situation where a player is going to be playing sort of three times a week constantly over and over again. It'll be very much sort of a squad game. So you would think that Chelsea having so many options, like, equally applicable to Liverpool, City, United as well, that those bigger squads will end up, that's going to help them massively. So I think we're going to see Silva will play quite a bit, but it's not going to be a case of him being sort of like, first name in the team sheet every week. I think it's quite inevitable that there will still be a lot of rotation. And I thought one of the big issues from Lampard's first season was that he didn't know his best team. He didn't know the best centre back partnership, and even at the end of the season, there were still so many question marks because he was switching depending on the opponent. He would have a back four. He might then switch to a back three. Like that FA Cup semi-final against United, for instance, tried it against Arsenal. it worked really well against Spurs earlier in the season as well. But you just went from game to game not really knowing who he was going to pick, especially at centre back. The full backs were a bit more easy to pick because it was essentially Azpilicueta at right back, and if he ended up moving at left back, Reece James came into play at right back, and you'd suspect that Reece James will end up playing a lot more this coming season. Whether that means Azpilicueta, obviously Ben Chilwell is still sort of recovering from a heel injury. He's back training alone. From what I've heard, he hasn't really joined in any group sessions yet. So that means he will almost certainly he'll miss the Brighton game next Monday, and then they play Liverpool at home the following Sunday. So it seems pretty doubtful that he'll be back in time for that. So yeah, I mean, you'd expect Azpilicueta will probably start at left back in those opening games with Reece James on the right. And honestly, of the 5 current options, the only one I would be surprised to see at centre back in those opening games would be Tomori. It'll be 2 of the other 4, and to be honest, I've no idea which ones it'll be for the first game.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really great assessment. And let's move on to the specific signings. You don't need to talk about all of them. You've already spoken about Silva in quite a lot of depth. I want to pick out 2 of them. So I want to pick out Ben Chilwell, although he's injured, so let's not talk about him. But quickly, what's your view on Ben Chilwell? Because obviously you're looking around Europe and you've got someone like Reguilon, for example, I think is a fantastic player. United have been linked with him. Chelsea were linked with him, I believe, before they signed Chilwell. Whether those links were stronger, they were tenuous. I think that's up for debate. I think Chilwell, as we know, has always been Frank Lampard's first choice. But for that amount of money invested in a left back, I think Chilwell is very good going forward. He's obviously got a good cross in him. He's a good shooter of the ball, especially long range shots. But again, it's that defensive deficiency which it's questionable whether he's actually an upgrade on Alonso in that respect, in the defensive part of the game. When you spend that much on a player, he's got to hit the ground running. So what's your view on him? I might as well ask all of them now then. And I think Kai Havertz is a one really which everyone's excited to see. Phenomenal talent, absolutely brilliant. He's so highly rated. He's got a sort of prime Mesut Ozil-esque sort of style of play. I think where I would have not doubts, but where he needs to work on is probably his off the ball work. When I've watched him, I don't think he's the best at that. I think Lampard will expect that. You look at Mason Mount, that's something he's excellent at. He's got a great attitude. He's always running and working hard for the team. But in terms of an upgrade in quality on the likes of Barkley and people like that, it's huge. He can play. He's very versatile. He obviously can play right wing. He can play false 9. Midfield, attacking mid. I think he needs to find a position as well. Attacking midfield would be for him, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, isn't there, to perform, especially coming with such a high price tag, big reputation, and I'm sure the rival fans will like to see him fail after one or 2 games. But he's the one. And let's choose one more. I want to talk about Timo Werner because he's a player that I wanted at United. I thought for the fee that was quoted, it was an absolute bargain considering his numbers that he put up. And do you expect him to be playing as a lone striker? Or do you expect him to be playing perhaps like off, let's say, a Giroud?
Start with Chilwell. So Chilwell, first off, was, like you mentioned, Lampard's sort of only real target, I think. He was the player that he'd wanted for since almost the very beginning. Obviously, there was left back has been an issue for Chelsea essentially since Ashley Cole left. They've gone through a series of players. None of them have really worked out. Alonso has been obviously the pick of them, but it was quite telling that last season the best left back in the squad was actually the right back, which sort of summed it up. I think Alonso is far better in a sort of as a wing back with a back 3 rather than a flat back 4, because there just are too many defensive question marks, positioning, timing, etc. But then again, you look at Chilwell and you think he's clearly an upgrade, but that fee is, despite them spending quite sensibly in terms of Werner, Ziyech, in terms of the fees, and Silva obviously being a free transfer, the Chilwell one is on paper looks quite high. But then if you dig in a little bit deeper, you have to factor in that there's always a premium on English internationals for obvious reasons. And ultimately, because Lampard was so set on signing him, there was no real prospect of any of those other names that have been mentioned
Alan, do
signing.
you think that? Sorry, quickly, just interrupt. Do you think
Yeah,
that he will get the Harry Maguire treatment? Because obviously Maguire is just solely based on his fee. Maguire's not a bad player, but the fact he's the most expensive defender of all time, that he is judging different standards. So will Chilwell get that same treatment from Chelsea fans? Because a lot of Chelsea fans didn't really want him when you had Tagliafico and Reguilon for half the price, arguably better players. And do you think that's something which is going to be a struggle for Chilwell, that pressure?
I don't. I don't. Obviously, there is a pressure with the fee, but that's applicable to any big money signing at any club. I don't see it affecting him too greatly. He seems like someone who isn't really phased by such things, and I think the match going Chelsea fans aren't going to be sort of, obviously once they're led back into stadiums, aren't going to be sort of jumping down his neck immediately, unless he is obviously absolutely terrible. He's not going to be. We know he's Premier League proven, and he also, considering his age, Lampard is 100% convinced that there's still huge room for development there as well. I do, yeah, I sort of agree that Tagliafico in particular, and the price would have perhaps on an economic from an economic point of view would have made more sense. But again, he's not Premier League proven, and that sort of was obviously the tipping point. But not to repeat myself, but Chilwell was Lampard's number one target, and there wasn't really any close number two. So it was always sort of simply a case of whether a deal could be struck with Leicester, who obviously they weren't under any obligation to sell. It may have worked out differently if Leicester had clung on to a Champions League place. But the fact that they obviously ended up falling out of the top four quite late on the final game of the season sort of made it sort of more certain that the move would end up happening. So yeah, I think Chilwell is he's clearly an upgrade, but the fee is very high for any defender. So yeah, I'm quite confident that he will end up doing really well.
Yeah, I think he'll be a good signing. I think people that are doubting him perhaps are doing it on the fact that the fee, and because, like you say, Tagliafico is a better option. And then I suppose the other one is Kai Havertz. Is he the one you're most excited to see? And then where do you think Timo Werner is going to play when we start? I think Werner might play lone striker, but he didn't do that much when he was at Leipzig.
Yeah, so I'll go back to Havertz in a second, but Werner is an interesting one in that I feel like throughout the course of the season he'll probably end up being used as this the sort of centre of the attack. But in the opening weeks, get the feeling that because Christian Pulisic is still out with a hamstring injury, the hamstring that he hurt in the FA Cup final is going to keep him out for another couple of weeks. We're not really sure how many games he's going to miss, but he's definitely he's not back in proper training yet or anything like that. So I get the feeling that Werner might end up playing on the left in those opening games with Abraham or possibly even Giroud as the centre of the attack, with Havertz behind him. I think, and the biggest. The thing I'm possibly most excited about in terms of the signings in general is the number of options, because Werner and Havertz obviously are so versatile, can play in any number of roles. It gives Lampard sort of so many different decisions to make, and he can sort of tweak it game to game and adapt to, depending on the opposition, what he feels will work best against them. So I don't. I think it's highly unlikely that either of those two players are going to be sort of pigeonholed into a specific role. Yes, inevitably they're going to be used in one position more than others, but I think we're going to see quite a fluid attack, and you'd sort of expect them to sort of even move around quite a bit in games, during games. You could sort of imagine if they're playing a team, a defensive-minded team, which Chelsea struggled against the low block quite a bit last season. You can imagine that Werner may end up starting a particular game as the middle of the front three. He could end up moving out to the wide left. Havertz might end up moving into sort of a false nine position, which he played in at Leverkusen quite a bit as well. But yeah, I'm quite excited about that. In terms of the Havertz point, I've not seen him live in person. I've seen quite a bit of him on TV, so I'm quite excited about seeing him up close in the coming weeks, just to see how, like, what does he actually look like? Because on television he strikes you as kind of this player who he looks quite. He's obviously quite tall. He's 6'2", 6'3", but he also looks quite light, and there's potential for him to maybe bulk up a little bit. But then obviously there's added concerns if a player bulks up and piles on a bit of weight. Does that like rob him of sort of agility and pace, etc.? Or is he going to be able to sort of stand up against bigger centre halves in the Premier League despite looking quite light like that? I'm quite interested to see how that develops. There had been sort of a story which gave me a bit of a laugh over the weekend, that there was a report in Germany saying that Mason Mount was unhappy about his arrival, which is complete nonsense.
Christian Falk said this, didn't he?
Yeah,
I saw that story break, and that was one that I definitely scratched my head. It's not true, is it?
No, it's not. And I think another sort of system that I'm quite interested in seeing if it's used and if it works out is if Havertz and Mount sort of play as joint number eights with Kante behind them, and I think that could work out quite well. Mount obviously is Mount and Azpilicueta were the two most used players last season. Lampard, I think Lampard sees a bit of himself in Mount, in terms of their games. Obviously, slightly, the game is a bit different to when Lampard was at his peak, and it's maybe not, the role of a midfielder maybe isn't as box to box as it would have been in the past. But in terms of the scoring ability, driving runs forward, Lampard does sort of see sort of a younger version of him in Mount, and Mount's pressing and his work off the ball. He does so much of that sort of unseen stuff that doesn't necessarily come across on television all the time. And if you if you go to a Chelsea game and you sort of spend a little bit of time just focusing solely on him, he just does not stop moving. And I think that is a massive part of just Lampard's overall philosophy in the game plan. And you touched on it a few minutes ago. It's also probably something that Havertz can improve on. You don't know if that's a product of coaching at Leverkusen. If it's he'd essentially been told that you are obviously the star player at Leverkusen. You're given the sort of the freedom to roam. There isn't as much emphasis on you tracking back and doing the sort of defensive dirty work. And I wonder if we're going to see him in Lampard's system, and whether he'll, when we see him in Lampard's system, if he'll be doing a lot more of that sort of defensive work and chasing down players and closing defenders down while they're in possession. Because every player is capable of that. It's not you don't need the sort of skill and the natural talent to do that. It's more about sort of mentality and work ethic. So it will be interesting to see if that part of his game sort of grows under Lampard. But yeah, I mean, Havertz, by some distance, is the one I'm sort of most excited about of all the new arrivals. And that's before you even sort of touch on Ziyech, who is, I think, because he'd signed so early, he's not become forgotten about, but he's sort of been put in the shade somewhat by the the more recent arrivals, and I think he could end up being sort of, just a really enjoyable player to watch. He's probably not the sort of, he doesn't have the sort of transformative effect that people expect from Havertz, and maybe even Werner to an extent. But in terms of talent, and this sort of the entertainment value, I am also really looking forward to seeing him, because I think of the 4-4 draw with Ajax last season, and his performance in that game was sort of, aside from I think a couple of the Bayern players in the champion in the round of 16 game a couple of months later, that his performance at Stamford Bridge that evening was the best I had seen from a player against Chelsea. Last year, he was just he appeared a level above everybody else on the pitch. So yeah, I don't think we should be. Let's not sleep on him completely
Yeah,
either.
absolutely. Well, he's not as expensive as well, so it's fantastic business, to seal a player like that. It's a bit like United sealing Van der Beek as well. That's again for such a reasonable price. Both players are fantastic. When you look at, obviously there's a lot of compilations going around, but the sort of synergy they had between them, and Ziyech, what he does really have is that final ball, and that's where Chelsea were lacking. And coming off, from the right with his left foot, we saw it in the game that Werner scored. Obviously, he played that ball to Hudson-Odoi. From the right flank, cutting in on his left and playing it in was fantastic. So that's going to be a massive asset. You can imagine how much Giroud could actually benefit from that, because there's not many better holding the ball up than Giroud in Europe. Very underrated player. But before I ask you about the goalkeeper position, because obviously that's an area which you mentioned in the beginning, I think everyone knows that Kepa has the risks of Jacob's cracker. I don't think he's particularly good at that. So sorry, Chelsea fans. Look, I'm a United fan. I'm probably one of the most unbiased people out there. I do a Premier League podcast, but he's just one player which I just think is for the money you paid. I just don't think he's good enough. But before we go on to him and obviously Grandad Caballero, let's talk about Callum Hudson-Odoi, because he's just one of those players where obviously broke onto the scene in fantastic fashion. He was incredible, and Bayern Munich were linked with him, and maybe the story would have been different if he made that move to Bayern. We don't know, but having that almost it's a career-threatening injury, isn't it? The Achilles, it's awful to do. Anyone that's had any sort of injuries, I've torn my ACL. I'm not pretending that I was ever amazing at football, but I've torn my ACL, and it takes a long time to recover. Even though these players have all the facilities and the top medics, it's still massive. And he really struggled last season. I think he looked a shadow himself. And how is he going to react? I mean, you obviously have contacts in the club and you spoke to people, but what's his mentality like, and how is he going to react to these top players coming in? Because for me, if he doesn't react, that says a lot about his mentality. I don't think the question is ability. Not at all. He's up there with ability-wise, probably with Greenwood, Saka, Phil Foden as the next generation of English talents coming through. But there are questions about his mentality. And do you expect him to rise to this, or is it a case of in a year's time he probably will go?
I don't think he'll go. It's a tricky one, because Jody Morris spoke back in, I think it would have been maybe January or February. He spoke quite well about how Hudson-Odoi had sort of risen through the academy and had been used to being the man in all of those underage teams, and it was sort of a straightforward rise as such. And then the injury comes, and like you said, in some cases that type of injury is career threatening. He was 18 years old, effectively, a child essentially. He hadn't even really played that much at the time. And if you look at the minutes played, he hasn't, obviously in those sort of appearances, and there was such a clamour from fans for him to be given more opportunities under Sarri, etc. He hasn't actually played that much. And when he came in last season, he did show flashes. And I think it's probably forgotten about because of the result and how Chelsea were completely outclassed by Bayern. But in that last game before the last game of the season, he was actually probably Chelsea's best player in that match in Munich. but Lampard has also stressed that it will be this season before we sort of get a proper gauge of where he's at. And similar can be said of Ruben Loftus-Cheek as well, who is coming off a pretty similar injury long term, and last season, despite featuring towards the end, was effectively a write off because of the injury. But now they've had a couple of weeks off. They've had a albeit shortened pre-season. You would expect to see a bit more from both of them. And I think Hudson-Odoi, the talent and the ability is obviously there. When he broke through, what kind of struck most was this sort of the confidence and self-belief. And it just seemed like, he knew he was really good. And I don't think the injury may have sort of impacted that slightly, but I don't think it's had a sort of a completely massive effect. So I would expect a lot of good from him this season. And again, because the season is so sort of packed and the schedule is so busy, I think between the start of the season this coming weekend and the end of it, there's going to be something, obviously discounting international breaks, there's going to be something like 4 midweeks without any football, which shows you how packed it's all going to be. So yeah, there's going to be plenty of rotation. And also, if you look at the options on the left, yes, you've got Pulisic when he returns from injury. Werner can play there. Ziyech can play on the right. But Pedro, Willian have left the squad. So there will be chances from there. Will get opportunities. One of Lampard's sort of favourite lines throughout the season, particularly when things were going well for Abraham and for Mount, and earlier last season, Tomori, he kept saying that the performance levels cannot drop, because the second they drop, they'll be out of the team. And I think that will be sort of true in reverse for Hudson-Odoi, where he will get the chance, but he knows he'll be told that you need to sort of come in and sort of hit the ground running, for want of a better phrase, and impress in those opportunities. And once he does that, he will get more and more. So it's completely up to him. And it's Lampard sort of sympathetic isn't probably the right word, but Lampard sort of, there's an awareness of Hudson-Odoi's age and the injury as well, and he's not going to be sort of. He is going to be quite patient, I feel, with him still this season, despite having given that sort of that warning towards the end of last season that it will be becoming. It will be the start of the season before we see him back to full sharpness.
Yeah, I agree. I think look, he's got to be managed properly. He obviously is a talent. I don't think you saw how much Chelsea wanted to keep him, obviously, when he was really excellent at the beginning of his career. So I hope for him, because it'd be sad to see a player that talented obviously not at least fulfill 75% of that potential. So yeah, fingers crossed for Chelsea fans that works out. And let's move on to Mr. Jacobs Crackers wrists, Kepa. Look, Chelsea have got a serious problem there. If you look at the amount of mistakes he made leading to goals, and also his save percentage was the lowest in Europe, I believe. I think I saw somewhere at the end of last season it was around 53%, which is just absolutely shocking. And we've seen this, that you can have the best attack. As you said, Chelsea have a very strong attack now, and midfield is looking excellent. Defense needs some work, but when you've got a keeper like that, we've seen in the past with David De Gea, prime David De Gea, that a quality keeper can save you 15 points a season. That's the difference between the title or not, top 4 or not. And then you look obviously at Liverpool, they had major issues with Karius and Mignolet, and they went and spent big on a excellent keeper, Alisson. You can't argue he's probably one of the best in the world right now. And it completely transformed their team. And any title-winning side needs a strong spine. They need a top quality keeper, top centre-back, a good midfielder, a quality midfielder, and a quality striker. That you always need a strong spine. You look at Chelsea in the past with the likes of Cech, Terry, Lampard, you had Makelele for a while, Drogba, always a strong spine. United have had the same. All the top title-winning sides have had the same. But you obviously know, you speak to people at the club. Is that position Chelsea are looking to strengthen? There are talks about Nick Pope. There are talks about Edouard Mendy, I believe, from Rennes. Looks a good keeper. Or is it a case of last chance saloon for Kepa? You spent this amount of money on him, 72 million, I believe. He needs to perform. You need to perform the season, otherwise you're out. Or is it a case of Chelsea just cutting their losses and looking to make a move for a new keeper?
Yeah, and the fee will also will always sort of linger in the background. And if you strip away the add-ons for the Havertz deal, he's effectively cost the same amount of money that Kepa did. Kepa was ultimately a panic buy when we know Chelsea had other targets that summer in terms of a new keeper. They went elsewhere, let's just say, and ended up sort of last minute bringing Kepa in. He is quite difficult. The one moment that stood out for me was the game away to Liverpool when Liverpool finally got the Premier League trophy. Towards the end of that game, there was a corner. No, there was a free kick from Liverpool's left, which I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure was Andy Robertson swung it in, and there were 6 or 7 Chelsea players in the box, 3 or 4 Liverpool players, and cross comes in. Most of those Chelsea players in the box sort of turn and look towards Kepa, expecting him to come out and make a pretty routine cross or catch a pretty routine cross. He doesn't, and a bunch of the players end up just like shouting his name and stare disbelievingly at him, and that sort of signaled that he had lost. That he'd lost basically confidence. The defense had lost confidence in him, and I think it's a long way back from there. It's the talent again is obviously there. It's just a case that we haven't seen it, and there were 1 or 2 appearances in the middle of last season. The one that stands out was actually against Liverpool as well in the FA Cup, and he made 5, maybe 6 saves in the first half of that game. And yes, it was only the FA Cup, and yes, Liverpool had made a number of changes, but he produced sort of a performance that you're kind of looking and thinking, why isn't he like this every week? Why is he why do we only see this sort of once every 2 months, and why are there 4 or 5 mistakes in between performances like this? Because it's blatantly obvious that the ability and the talent is there, and I'm not sure why we haven't seen that. Is it sort of, is he unhappy? Is there sort of something else behind the scenes that we don't know about? You just don't know. Does he not like living in London? Does he want, is he struggling to sort of integrate himself, in the city or whatever? You don't know these things. I'm not saying any of those are true. It's just kind of pointing out that there are often unforeseen things behind the scenes that, people from a distance, people who aren't in the dressing room, don't really know about. So that could possibly be it. And, would I be 100% surprised if we're sort of halfway through the season and we're kind of thinking, hold on a second, Kepa's actually been really good? I wouldn't be totally shocked if that happened. Then again, at the same time, I'm not sure who starts next Monday against Brighton. Does Caballero still start? Caballero had sort of ended the season saying that he wanted to fight for the #1 shirt, but at the same time, he's older than Petr Cech. Had There had been talk sort of earlier last season that it would end up being his final campaign. He'd end up retiring. There were sort of whispers that his family had been saying, maybe it's time that you do retire, etc. Whatever. He ended up signing a new 1-year extension to his contract, and it's 50-50 for me whether it's Caballero or Kepa in goal against Brighton. But then the issue is there aren't many alternatives in terms of goalkeepers to bring in. We've heard Andre Onana from Ajax was a potential keeper was linked, and Onana's gone on the record previously saying that he would like to one day play in the Premier League. seems like a perfectly good goalkeeper who would do quite well. Beyond that, obviously Jan Oblak. There had been a little speculation there, but he's just going to be far too expensive, and he's going to be far too expensive because no other club is going to be willing to spend anywhere close to 72 million on signing Kepa. And I think the only not hope, but the only sort of way out of it would be for him to go on loan somewhere temporarily with sort of an option to buy built in or something like that. But that's not going to happen unless Chelsea are certain that they have a goalkeeper coming in who's capable of being number one. So yeah, it remains sort of up in the air for now. I'm quite interested to see how that happens. But if he ends up being number one for the season and doesn't show drastic improvement, then I don't think there's any way Chelsea can contend for a Premier League title, or sort of any. They're not going to go deep into the Champions League. They're not going to sort of, you may end up seeing them, winning a Carabao Cup or an FA Cup just because there are so few games in those competitions. But in terms of the big two, there is no way you can win either of those if you have a goalkeeper who's performing at such a low ability most weeks. It's for a club with those sort of ambitions and expectations, it's just not acceptable to have a player who's frequently letting goals in so cheaply.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a difficult one. I think right now I'd probably be playing Caballero ahead of Kepa, and it's sort of it's difficult to say because I do agree Kepa does have talent. It's just the best of a bad bunch, isn't it? Really, like which one is gonna make less mistakes, and that's not what you need at a top club. And I think it's a position as well where there is quality out there. I think you could vouch for several different options, but again, price is an issue. But Alan, I'm aware we've gone over time a little bit, but I'm going to ask you your last question, and what's your expectation for next season, and what represents a good season? Because look, as an outsider looking in, as a non-Chelsea fan, with the amount of money that's been spent, for me personally, I'd be saying if this was United, they spent this much money, I'd be saying you have to challenge for the title. There's no questions about it. I would have to say, Chelsea would have to be, I would say, probably within 10 points of the top, let's say come March. They'd have to go at least to the quarterfinals of the Champions League, and they'd have to win a domestic trophy because no other team around Europe is going to spend and be backed as well and won't have spent as well as Chelsea have, I don't think, come October the 5th when the transfer window shuts. So quickly, in a minute, what's your expectations for next season? And look, I'm not saying Lampard's going to get sacked, so that's not what I'm saying, Chelsea fans. But I'm saying, if he doesn't get top four, could you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, top four is the sort of minimum requirement. I think beyond that, what's expected is for the gap to Liverpool and to City to be closed significantly. It was 33 points. Liverpool ended up at 99. Chelsea ended up at 66 last season. That needs to be ideally within single figures. I would say cutting that gap to 10 would probably be acceptable. I still feel that until the goalkeeping situation is solved, nobody should really be expecting them to win the Premier League title, just because it's such a key part of any. If you look through all the Premier League champions, they've all had very good goalkeepers. There hasn't been a title winner with sort of a questionable player between the posts. But at the same time, it seems, you've said you're a United fan. United spent close to 200 million last season when you include sort of both windows, which isn't massively different to what Chelsea spent this summer. And because, like I sort of mentioned quite a while back, that the bulk of that money had come from the Hazard and Morata sales. It doesn't look at, once you factor in those things, it doesn't probably look as dramatic an outlay as what it seems initially. But yeah, it's a case of just there needs to be progress. The gap needs to be closed. But I don't think Lampard. The only way Lampard ends up at the end of the season under pressure in terms of his job is if they miss out in the top four. And with that squad, I feel like things would need to go drastically wrong for them to miss out on at the Champions League. But yeah, they're still some way off catching City and Liverpool. And personally, I feel like City are the ones to catch this season, just because I don't know. Liverpool's inactivity. And
if you don't invest, you stand still, don't you? You need to invest when you're at the top.
Yeah,
and Liverpool and City are addressing those areas, aren't they?
Yeah, and City are obviously targeting defensive issues in particular, and I think they will be the ones to catch. And once Chelsea are sort of, like you said, if they're still sort of clinging on to a title race come March, and then end up, they may fade a little bit in the final weeks or something like that. But if they end up you end up looking come the end of May at a table that has them 8-9 points behind, then I think it's a qualified success and a clear sign of progress. And yeah, from where they've come from sort of the beginning of last season, that would be, if you were to draw it on sort of a graph or a chart, it would clearly be going upwards.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think Chelsea fans have a lot to look forward to next season. And obviously, I don't want to wish them too much luck, but no, they've done some great business. And Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Honestly, I know we've gone over time, and I apologise for that, but the conversation was brilliant, and you gave a fantastic insights. Just tell the listeners where they can find. We'll put your @handle in the description, where they can find more of your articles.
So just on football.london, you can get you can get everything there, and then I tend to tweet pretty much everything out anyway. Handle is just my name with 90 at the end.
Nice one.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much.
No problem. Cheers. And
cheers.
Just all listeners, make sure that you like and subscribe, and we'll put Alan's @handle in there as well, so you can give him a follow. And